It's always interesting when they start announcing for you guys to move to the center of the aisle. I've got so many VIP seats right here in the front, and no one took me up on it. So anyway, you can move to the front during this message, especially if you're like, I don't understand, just get closer. It'll make sense. Just come on in and get closer. I really don't understand it either, but I'm going to try to. No, I was at that point with this message, but I'm going to try to unpack it for you. It was January the 18th, 2009. My wife Shauna and I, along with Tim, who you just saw up here, and his wife Kristen Milner, as well as Ben and Lindsay Lee, the six of us, and then Brad and Mary came on later, but the six of us really were honed in on the idea that God was igniting this vision in our hearts to start a church somewhere in the Bay Area. And so what we began to do, we began to research and we began to think, and before this January 18th, we had spent 50 days praying from November 30th. I remember it vividly. The six of us wrote prayer guides, and we prayed for 50 days, and on day 50, January 18th, 2009, we had a 4-day trip out here. That's about all we could afford. The six of us shared a $53 a night hotel room out by the airport. I remember that. We were just like, oh, we have no money. We're these poor church planters. Help us out. And the six of us shared a room. There's crazy stories with that, but later, okay? Only if you give a lot of money will I tell you that story. But January 18th, we flew out here from 3 different states where all of us were living. We were all employed other places. We had churches we belonged to, other cities and states around the nation. But we were pretty sure that God had led us to somewhere in the Bay Area. And so we had 4 days, and we prayed, God, would you make it really clear to us, where is it? What's the spot? What's the city? It's certainly not the city. Like, that would be too crazy. And so 7.5 million people, it's probably one of these suburbs, and that's what God has for us because that's all we could probably handle. And so I'll never forget, it was Wednesday night. We had spent 3 days, full days, seeing San Jose, Oakland, Mountain View, Palo Alto, everywhere, a city, of course, all around the Bay. And I'll never forget, we were headed to dinner the last night we were there, and I just pulled over on the side of the road. We were a little bit early. We had this rental van. I remember to this day, it was a light blue Toyota Sienna, and so I just pulled over, and I could have pulled that one where, being the lead pastor and kind of the leader of the whole deal, I could have said, hey, this is what we're doing, whether you like it or not. But I try not to lead like that. I'm willing to, okay? But I try not to. That's not my first glance at leadership, hopefully. But I'm willing to revert to the dictator thing for sure. So I just pulled over and I said, hey, let's talk. Where is God calling us to plant a church? And it was so cool. Shauna was in the front seat, I think, beside me. At least she should have been if she wasn't. But she was beside me, and then there's 2, and then 2, and just one by one they began to speak up, and they said San Francisco, the city. San Francisco, the city. And I was like, no, guys, it's Palo Alto. Just kidding. I didn't say that. I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is. And we were stunned and we were shocked, but we were convinced that this was indeed the city God was calling us to start a church. We didn't have any money raised at this date. We didn't have a name of the church. We didn't have any of your beautiful faces in mind. We didn't know, but we knew this. This was crazy. We didn't expect it. We really had looked at a couple of suburbs and done a lot of research on those, but like, nope, it's the city. And not only was it clear to us that it was the city, but it was very clear to us that it was this Soma neighborhood. And so we are not in this neighborhood just because it's the cheapest rent we could find. All right? That is not why we are here this morning renting space and have done for the last couple of years. And we believed and still believe that this is where some of you are like, oh, boys, are they moving? No. I'm just telling you a story that sets up the message, okay? No, you're fine. We're good. We did believe then, and we still believe today. It's crazy. Over 4 years later, we still believe that this is where God has for us. But as we began to share the vision, I remember telling people, hey, we're moving to San Francisco. We're going to plant this church, moving in about 1.5 years. And we particularly believe that the clear vision is for the Soma neighborhood. And so I remember having a conversation with a guy, having him tell me he's very familiar with this area, and having him tell me what were going to be the challenges of us starting a church, not just in San Francisco, but starting a church in Soma. And here's what he said to me. He said, you need to know that most of the people who live around that area, they're very well educated. They've accomplished a lot or are on their way to accomplishing a lot. Most of them are fairly affluent. They're very busy, but when they have free time, they have so many options. And the big deal is, I remember this phrase, he said, they're pretty much insulated from having any needs in their life. I was like, perfect. But what he was saying was, if they find themselves in any needy situations, they're able to provide for their needs. They have a lot of capabilities, they have experience, they have education, they have intelligence, they have wealth. Whatever they need, they can figure out a way to make it happen. And he said, so it's going to be surprising for many of them, at least initially, and this is where we begin to pray, and what's really cool to see this room full this morning. We begin to pray, and just God would make clear to us what we needed to do and make clear to the people here what their needs are. And the guy told me, he said, most of them don't really probably think they need God, much less a church. And they're not going to have time for that. They're not going to, so I'm glad you guys have nothing else better to do this morning. Thanks for coming, helping my confidence out this morning. But that's what he said to me. And for those of you that are just new to Epic as of this morning, or you haven't been a part of this series that we've been tracking in for a while, we're doing this No More Religion series. And here's the premise of what Paul's saying. What we've been doing is studying this letter that a guy named Paul wrote to some churches that he helped start in an area called Galatia in the 50, 60 AD or so. And what he's saying to them, and why we've called the series No More Religion, and particularly in the text this morning, here's what he's saying. He's saying, you Galatians are trying to rely on yourselves to get you everything that you need. Primarily, you're relying on yourself to gain access to God. And so what the Galatians have had happen, some false teachers came in, stood on a stage like this, or sat down in front of the crowds, and they would say things like, hey, the Jesus thing doesn't get you there completely. You need to work for it. You need to rely on yourself. And so what they had begun to do is to rely on their own capabilities. Some of us do the very same thing. Most of the things that happen in our lives we can take care of. If your car breaks down today, what are you doing? AAA. Come on, taking care of it? If you don't have anything left in savings, you're walking. I mean, there's a lot of options, right? But we take care of whatever the situation is. We provide. We're capable. We have the money. We have the expertise. If you encounter a project at work this week, it may seem difficult at first, but you'll do your research. You'll gather a team together, and you'll have it solved. And you'll be like, I can do this. And so what's natural for every one of us in the room is to bring our capabilities into the spiritual realm and see what can we do to provide for ourselves and produce in our own life what we're capable of producing. And that's what the Galatians had turned to. And what Paul's going to say to them, and thereby speak to us this morning, is, hey, when you rely only on your own capabilities to produce things in your life, there are other things you have to forfeit. And so what he's going to plead with the Galatians, what I want to plead with you this morning is, don't rely only on your own self to produce certain things, because if you do, then you only get what you can get. Does that make sense? So if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn to Galatians chapter 4. If you need a Bible, lift a hand up. We'll get one into your hands. And if you have one of those Bibles coming now, we're on page 632. The rest of us, Galatians chapter 4. We'll start in verse 21. And I've got to be honest, at least for this part of the message, I've got to be honest. I'll try to be honest for the whole thing, but here, man, rough crowd. I need a secondary job if this doesn't work out, so I'm testing the market. A few weeks ago, when I was preparing for this message, I literally got to a point, Lindsay and Tim were in the office, so they can attest to this. I said, hey guys, I think I'm just going to not teach out of Galatians for this text. I'm just going to talk about Uganda and our partnership there. This thing doesn't make any sense to me, okay? So if you read this in a second, you hear this, you're like, bizarre, yes, okay? And you're not alone. But I'm so glad I didn't give up on the text. It is a great illustration that Paul's making, but it will seem bizarre at first. So would you stand up? Let's read this. I'll read it out loud. Follow along. You'll want to fall asleep and be like, this is too difficult, or I'm not spiritual enough to understand this. This is where the pastor was. So you're at least as spiritual as he is, perhaps. 21, and then we'll finish the entire chapter in verse 31. Listen in. Make sure you listen closely. Even you'll have a lot of questions, and I'll try to share with you some things that God has really shown me. And as I dug a little deeper, there's some beautiful reality. So don't fall asleep. Lean in and listen close. Paul writes to them. Remember, they're trying to live by the law. He says, tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Confused yet? Anybody? Have a seat and let's figure out what Paul is trying to say there. You want to lean in for this. This is helpful. So, Paul is using a historical event, the story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Isaac, Ishmael, if you want to include both of the sons that are being referenced here. Paul is using this story that is a very well-known event in Jewish history and has become a very well-known event in Christian history as well. And so you may be familiar with it. If not, let me give you a reference point. Genesis chapters 12 through 22 really give you the breadth of the story of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Ishmael, Hagar, the ones that are being referenced here, so you can understand everything because it's a fascinating story. I've taught on Abraham a few times here at Epic. You can find that on our website, I believe. So he's using this story they're very familiar with, but he's going to interpret it for them in an allegorical way. He's going to help them see where they, the Galatians, and therefore I want you to see where you and I fit into the story, what characters we can be represented by out of this great story. And so that's why I want you to really pay attention. Let me give you the big idea for the story that will help us with this text. In Genesis chapter 15, you've already had Abraham leave his homeland and his country at the age of 75. God was going to do something great in Abraham, and what God does in Genesis 15 is he says to Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. So that's not just a song that your preschool teacher made up. That's a song, right? Everybody know the song? Father. On tune, come on. All right, we'll stop there. We had the bass in the back giving us a rendition I've never heard, but nonetheless, so God says you'll be a father, you'll have many offspring. In fact, God said this. He's such a great visual illustrator. And so what God says to Abraham, he's like, come outside the tent. I want you to look up. And Abraham looks up and he sees, as you might imagine, countless stars. And God says to Abraham, can you count the stars? Can you count the stars that you see? And Abraham's like, 1, 2. All right, we don't have time for that. No, I can't. And God says, as innumerable as the stars are, so shall your offspring be. Only a couple problems with that. He's going to have many, many offspring. As of that moment, he doesn't have any. Problem, right? Not only does he not have any, the text would later say that at that point in time, when it came to producing children, Abraham was as good as dead, okay? Not going to illustrate that for you. I just want you to know he doesn't have what it takes to bring about children, okay? And so God has made this promise in Genesis 15. But in just one chapter over, I want you to see what Sarah, who is Abraham's wife, what her response is to this. So God enters into covenant. You'll see it on the screen if you don't want to flip there. If you do, first book of the Bible, chapter 16, verse 2. Before their names were Sarah and Abraham, their names were Sarai and Abram, okay? So that's the names you will see referenced, but he's referring to Sarah and Abraham that you may or may not be familiar with. And so that's what he's referencing. So remember, God has said to them, you will have a son, not just a son, you will have many, many offspring. Abraham, I'm making a covenant with you. I'm going to provide. You will be a father of many, many nations. And so that's the promise God made. And let's see if Sarah and Abraham did a good job of relying on God, just like we do perfectly in this area all the time, right? We're just going to rely on God. Let's see if Sarah's like us in this. No, she is. Verse 2 of 16, and Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So just on the surface, it's a great soap opera, right? Right? Ladies, this is not a path you need to go down to acquire children, all right? This is no recommendations like Sarah made to her husband shall you make, okay? Everybody clear? We good on that? We'll set the relational counseling aside and pick up the text, but just make sure we're good on that. So what in the world does Paul mean when he's telling the Galatians, you're like Sarah in this situation? Here's Sarah's story, right? God says, I'm going to provide a child, many offspring, in fact, for you and Abraham. But what did Sarah say, essentially, to God? No, you won't. Really? No, you won't. I'm barren, and even if I wasn't barren when I was younger, I'm older now, and the chances of me having kids, guess where they are? Big fat 0, God. But during this time period, and many people still experience this today, during this time period, for Sarah, the most valuable thing and the most worthwhile thing she could ever imagine being was what? Mom. You see it all throughout the Old Testament. Longing to have children. You see it in the New Testament. Right? And you see it with people like Hannah when she gives birth to Samuel. She longed for that. And Sarah's longing for a child. And here's what you need to know. God doesn't have a problem answering her prayer. He just has a problem answering her prayer the way she wants to go about it. Okay? God is not upset at her desire to be a mom. In fact, God, of his own initiative, is going to make this thing happen later on. But what Sarah does is she essentially tells the God, I can't trust you. I cannot rely on you, so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to take things into my own hands. So much so, she wanted to manipulate the situation so much and control the situation so much. And here's what's interesting. There's a lot of things that Sarah was probably capable of doing, right? There's a lot of things you and I are capable of doing. But Sarah was incapable of making herself bear children. So what did she do? She had great faith like you do every time. She just waited on God. She didn't. She didn't. She said to her husband, we're going to bring this about some way. I've got to have children. God's closed my womb. I know what he promised, but he's just tricking us. He's not really going to bring it about. So here's what we're going to do, Abram. Think about this. I'm going to give you my servant. Go spend a night with her. And that way, she's probably fertile. She'll be able to produce our children. You guys understand that part of the story, right? I can't go into it any further without rating the movie a different rating than what you had when you came in. And the question is, what is Paul saying to the Galatians? What is Paul saying to the Galatians when he's like, hey, you're like the son, you're acting like a son of the slave woman, which is Hagar. What is he saying? He's saying that Sarah was convinced she had to take this into her own hands because she did not believe that God was going to sufficiently provide what she longed for. Here's what he's saying to the Galatians. You don't believe. Listen, remember, Paul planted the churches. Paul shared the gospel which is God giving grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus alone, makes us in right relationship with God. That's the heartbeat of the gospel. A lot of implications from that's the heartbeat. Grace alone, faith alone, Jesus alone. And Paul gave that message to the Galatians, but then these false teachers came in and they said, hey, you can rely on yourself. You can get circumcised and get better standing with God. You can observe days and months on the calendar, get better standing with God. You can be more religious and get better standing with God. So why is he bringing in Sarah? Here's why. The Galatians are doing exactly what Sarah was doing. They didn't think they could trust God's provision for them, so they took things into their own hands, and they began to achieve what they were capable of. And it's likely that with a big crowd like this in here this morning, that many of us have or are doing the same. Sarah was unwilling to rest in the promise God made for his provision in her life. Are you resting in the provision God's made for your life? Namely that of Jesus, but provision in every way. Are you resting in that? Or are you trying to figure out a way to manipulate systems and exert control to bring about the outcome that you want to have in your life? Are you resting in what God has done, or are you trying to produce it on your own? Because here's the thing, if it's up to you, just like it was up to Sarah, whatever she could come up with would be the best she could do, right? And whatever you and I can come up with, whatever we're capable of, it's the best we could do. A few things as you start with the text. In verse 21, Paul's getting at the heart of the whole letter. He says, tell me, you who desire to be under the law. Paul had let them know that Jesus came to do something better than the law could do. Point of the law that we've said in this series is the law of God, the commandments of God. They give us the problem, right, that we're at enmity with God, that we're separated from God. But what do they not give us? a solution. Here's where you miss it, but I can't help you get there. That's what the law does. And Paul's saying if you are going to take the whole law, then you're under the law. Then you've got to be perfect. You've got to be religious. You do have to be circumcised. You have to obey all 600 laws. You've got to do it all. But the question is, even if you do all those things, will it be enough to get you to God? Like those of you who desire to be under the law. And then in 22 and 23, here's where some of the imagery comes in. It says, for it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman. Okay, the slave woman is Hagar. All right. We're going to repeat this. The slave woman is Hagar. Awesome, Hagar, and one by a free woman. The free woman is Sarah. But the son, verse 23, of the slave was born according to the flesh, meaning what could be produced in human terms, what could be produced biologically, what made sense, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Here's what Paul is trying to tell them. Here's like the big, earth-shattering realization for me in my study time. Paul's trying to tell the Galatians this. Here's where the story comes in that seems so bizarre at first. Like slave woman, free woman, what does this mean? Who am I? What's going on? Mount Sinai, what? Here's what he's doing. He's telling the Galatians with the story of Sarah. If salvation is by works, by what you accomplish, if salvation is by works, listen to this, then only the fertile can have children. Like, huh? Yep, I'm going to say it again. Put your best thinking cap on, okay? He's saying to the Galatians, he's using this story. He's saying, if you only can produce what you're capable of in your life and in your relationship with God, if that's all you can produce, then guess what? Then only the fertile get to have children. Trying to evaluate the blank stares. All right, here's what he's trying to say. And I'll give you a few more examples. He's saying this, that Galatians, if you, like Sarah, want to only do what you're capable of, or what is only human or even biologically possible, if salvation is by works, then only the fertile get to bear children. A few more examples. Also, only the most qualified can get the job. Only the most deserving men can have great wives. Only the most gifted pastor gets to plant churches like this. Only the religious can have God. Do you see it? He's saying if you depend and if you rely on yourself, then only the fertile get to have children, metaphorically speaking. This is a really amazing stuff. I hope your brains are just churning and you're not zoning out. I'm just trying to read you. He's saying if salvation is by works, like if you can rely on yourself, then guess what? The only people that get in are the people that get it right. Meaning this, only people that get in are the people who've never messed up in a relationship. How many people are disqualified in this room? All of us. Then the only people that get access to God are only the people who've gone to church long enough and know enough answers. That's what he's saying. But hear this isn't true at all with God, is it? Do you know that God delights in giving us what we can't and are incapable of producing on our own? Do you know that God delights in that? Like, I want you to think about whatever your job is. I want you to think about your sweet spot at your job, okay? Like, what's the one thing, hobby or job, whatever it is, school, whatever, what's the one thing when you're working in that environment? Like, that's my sweet spot. I want you to think about that, okay? And if you don't have one, we need to change careers. I think you should at least get to play in your sweet spot a few times a week. The more you get into that, I think the more you become the person God designed you. Of course, if you're lazy, that's not a sweet spot. That's a different story. I know that God delights in a lot of things that he does, but just personally, I think God super delights when he does something for us that we can barely believe because we were incapable of producing it in our own lives. When people say to me, and we get this question a lot, hey, Ben, and it's not being crazy, but Ben, how have you guys started such a strong church in San Francisco? Well, the pastor is awesome. I mean, what do you mean? Have you met me? No, when we had no clue how it would go, my wife and I said, you know what, God, we're going to trust you. We're incapable of this. We're going to bring our 3 little boys, and we're going to raise them in a city like San Francisco. And just to be honest, and God doesn't owe me anything for the future, I think that's why our family's thriving in this city that would seem like a city that may be the hardest to thrive in out of all the cities we've lived in, because I think God delights to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And this is really where this series collides with the Rejecting Status Quo series, because some of us, we think it's only up to us, and so we never lean in. We never go for things with God or in life or in work that seem impossible. Why? Because we think it's only up to us. But God seems to delight. God seems to delight in showing up for people who can't provide for themselves. In fact, let me give you this statement. This is my favorite statement. I didn't make it up, but you should be delighted by it as well once you think about it. What Paul is trying to say is this: the gospel isn't only for fertile Hagars, it's also for barren Sarahs. I want the light to go off, all right? I'm going to just keep repeating it until oh, they're convinced. The gospel isn't only for the capable. It's for those who can admit that they're not. The gospel isn't only for the fertile Hagars, it is for the barren Sarahs. In fact, Tim Keller, in his book Galatians for You, he would go on to say it's especially for the barren Sarahs, because in those moments when you realize that you're bankrupt in some area and God shows up, guess who gets the credit? God seems to show off in these kind of moments. When you realize, hey, I'm incapable of this, but I want it. God, would you do it? Would you provide this? Would you bring this about? God, I'm bankrupt. I don't have the relational skills. God, I'm 35 and I still haven't had a kid. God, I can't do this. Would you? And God seems to show off when we recognize that we are spiritually bankrupt or some other area of our life, we can't produce it. God seems to show up and show off in those ways. Look at verse 27. If when we read it on the surface a second ago, you're like, what does this mean? I want you to understand it now. Paul says, borrowing from the prophet Isaiah, this is from Isaiah 54, verse 1. I'll read the first half of verse 27. Paul says, for it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. What in the world? I want you to keep the illustration in mind, okay? Allegorical. Beautiful visual illustration Paul's giving. Here's what he's saying. How can he say, rejoice, O barren one? How can he say that to the Galatians? Bless you. How can he say that? Why would he say, rejoice, O barren one, break forth and cry aloud? Why would he say that? He could only say that if the barren one is going to do what one day? Just speaking plain here. Come on, elementary. Right? Do you see what he's saying? Rejoice, O barren one, you're incapable, but God isn't. Here's what he's saying to the Galatians. Rejoice, O barren ones, rejoice. Listen, you can't bring yourself to God, but you can rejoice. Why? Because God's bringing himself to you. This is brilliant language Paul's using. He's saying, rejoice, O barren one. Break forth and cry aloud. You're going to have the baby. Here's what he's saying to Galatians. Rejoice, you who can't do enough religious deeds to get yourself to God. Rejoice, you who cannot save yourself. Rejoice, you who are not good enough. How does he say that to the Galatians? Same way, think of the illustration. Because why? Because God's going to do for them what they are incapable of doing for themselves. Isn't that good? Man, you guys just got to look at it longer, I guess. This has been mind-blowing for me. Really, I almost didn't teach from this text. I'm like, I don't get it. Rejoice. How can I rejoice, God? I can't do this. I'm not good enough, God. You know my past. You know the kind of family I grew up in, God. You know where I've failed in relationships, God. You know where I've been terrible as a parent, God. I can't do this. He says, Ben, rejoice. Why? How? Because I have done for you what you're incapable of doing for yourself. Anybody else think that's good? That's awesome. Here's what Oswald Chambers says in his book, great devotional book, My Utmost for His Highest. I want to repeat it because I love this. He says, God can do nothing for me until I recognize the limits of what is humanly possible, allowing him to do the impossible. Let's unpack it again. God can do nothing for me until I recognize the limits of what is humanly possible, Sarah, Galatians, you, me, until I recognize what is humanly possible. So then and only then will God begin to bring about the impossible. As long as you don't think you have any limits, guess what? Christianity makes no sense for you. As long as you don't have any limits, who cares if God exists, because you don't need him. But I hope you've lived long enough. I hope you've been around people enough. I've hoped you've seen yourself enough to know you're a limited being. And if it ended there, we should leave here depressed because we're limited. But if we can, in the moment that we recognize we are limited, also recognize that God is not, that paves a good path for your future. This is the heart of our faith, just so you know. When people are like, what's the heart of this? The heart of it is this God has invited us into something that we could not produce for ourselves. That's the heartbeat of Christianity. This is why we pray, right? If you want to know whether or not you believe this statement, think about your own prayer life. If you've not reached your limits yet, you don't have a prayer life. Why? Because guess who can handle it? We can. Someone once said that prayer can do anything God can do, and God can do anything. The reason that I should pray differently than I'm probably praying at this season of my life is because I'm limited. This is the reason you and I should love the gospel message, the reality that we are limited, we can't bring ourselves to God, but God, in his great mercy and in his grace and at great cost of the death of his son to him, he brings about something for us that we couldn't bring about. This is why I tell our staff, hey, let's be faithful with the gifts God's given us. Let's steward those well. Let's strategize. What does Epic need next? What's the future? When should we add a service? Well, probably when it fills up like this a few times in a row. When should we do all this? But at the end of the day, here's what we do. Here's what we have to do. At the end of the day, we go, God, here's our best. But God, for a movement to happen at Epic Church San Francisco, you have to bring it about. Are you only pursuing things that you're capable of? We asked this question in the Status Quo series. I'm sure you guys have slept a lot since then. We asked it a lot. And we asked it a lot in that series in terms of like, hey, are you willing to go for what God has for you, even if you don't feel qualified and it takes a miracle for it to happen? But here's what we're saying. Here's how we're going to blend these two together with this series, No More Religion. If you aren't willing to pursue something that you can't handle yourself, then it's actually impossible for you to have a relationship with God. Say that again. If you aren't willing to pursue something that you can't produce yourself, then it's actually impossible for you to have a relationship with God. Why? Because God initiates, but God provides the only way possible to be reconciled to him. You can't come to church enough to get it. You can't read the Bible enough to get it. You can't do enough good deeds to get it. You can't do it. But the cool thing is we've gained access because of Jesus to a limitless God. So let the weight roll off your shoulders. You don't have to produce what's most valuable, just like Sarah didn't have to. She did have to trust. So let me ask you, how's your trust in God's provision this morning? How's your trust? Are you leaning into who he is, to what he's done? Or are you going, you know what? No, I've got to accomplish this myself. I can't take that gift. And if you don't take that gift, then it is up to you, then it is on your shoulders. And in the end, you'll still leave frustrated because you can't bring that about. The good news is you don't have to. He's handed you a gift. But it requires your resting and trusting in what he's done on your behalf. Have you reached that place? If not, I want to invite you to take that step of faith this morning. The gospel isn't just for those who can handle things for themselves. In fact, it's especially for those who recognize they can't produce nor provide what's most important and what's most critical for this life and for eternity. Even if you're not ready to take that step, I hope and pray that you'll consider it for longer than a moment. Would you all pray with me? The band's going to come back up and lead us in a song. My hope and prayer for you and for me out of this message is that this would resonate pretty deeply within us. that this would resonate deeply within us, and that we would be so grateful to God producing in us and for us what we are incapable of producing ourselves. So it doesn't matter this morning how intelligent you are, or how many degrees you have, or how much money you have, or how long you've done the church thing. None of that gets you what you ultimately need. I think the idea in mind here is surrender. God, surrender. I'm laying down trying to do it myself. I'm surrendering. I'm to your plan, your purpose, your initiative. And what Paul tried to tell the Galatians is what I want to say to you. That he's saying to them, hey, you're children of the free woman, to use allegory, but you're living like you're children of the slave woman. You're living like you have to take things into your own hands. And he's just saying, hey, the nails were driven into Jesus' hands so you wouldn't have to take them into your own. But you've got to respond by faith. You've got to respond by trust and resting in what God's done for you. I hope this will be good news to you. I hope even as we sing this song and kind of declare some of the realities we've spoken of this morning, that you will be moved, but that you'll consider this message long after we leave here too. God, I thank you for making this come alive in my heart. God, I thank you that you love this church more than I do. God, that you have a greater vision for this church more than I do. God, I thank you that when we couldn't get ourselves to you, you came up and devised a great plan to come to us. God, I thank you that religion doesn't get us in, and wealth doesn't get us in, and education won't get us in, but grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus alone, provides the way, gets us the path in. God, I pray that the men and women and boys and girls in this room would rest in that. And then, God, would we realize that you are able to do what we're impossible, what is impossible for us. Help us to know that, God. We want to declare just in these moments this morning, God, that you're good, that you do good. God, it's almost unbelievable what you've done for us, but I pray that we'd have enough faith to believe and to rest and trust it. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand. Let's respond.